Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second session of the 2021 Pathways to Law Conference. Thank you for joining us. My name is Danielle Lewis, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Community Services Committee of the Asian American Bar Association of the Greater Bay Area. By way of reminder, the purpose of this conference is to provide you with advice and insights from Asian American and Pacific Islander judges and attorneys and law students. Today, we have the Public Law Public Interest panel, which features attorneys and judges practicing in the public sector. I'm pleased to introduce you to our moderator, Justice Tracie Brown. Justice Brown was appointed to the California Court of Appeal in 2018. She's previously served for 5 years on the San Francisco Superior Court. Justice Brown graduated from Harvard University and received a JD from UC Berkeley School of Law. She clerked for Judge Margaret McEwen on the Ninth Circuit, was an associate at Morrison & Foerster and Cooley LLP. She then joined the U.S. Attorney's Office, where she tried civil and criminal cases and argued before the Ninth Circuit. Justice Brown received Asian American Bar Association's Joe Morozumi Award and the California State Bar's Jack Berman Award for her work on a pro bono case representing San Francisco's Japanese American community. Justice Brown has also taught at the UC Berkeley School of Law since 2013. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Justice Brown.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and I'm really happy to be here this morning. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our other speakers. First, Justice Goodwin Lowe. Justice Lowe has served as an Associate Justice on the California Supreme Court since 2011. Before that, he was a professor at the UC Berkeley School of Law. His many areas of expertise include constitutional law, educational law and policy, and diversity in the legal profession. Justice Lowe is the son of Taiwanese immigrants, and he went to Stanford University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in biology. He then went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship and earned a master's degree in philosophy and physiology. When he came back to the United States, he helped launch the AmeriCorps National Service Program and worked for 2 years as a senior program officer at the Corporation for National Service. He graduated from Yale Law School, becoming the first person in his family to earn a law degree. And among other post-law school jobs, he clerked for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Lowe teaches constitutional law as a visiting professor at the Harvard Law School, and we're going to hear a little bit about some groundbreaking research he has done on Asian Americans and the legal profession. Next is Kevin Lowe. Immigration attorney at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus, where he represents low-income people facing deportation. Before working with Asian Law Caucus, he worked on counterterrorism and human rights issues with Reprieve in London. He assisted LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers with the Organization for Refuge, Asylum, and Migration, and he led labor campaigns in Southeast Asia and the American South with the United Auto Workers Organization. Mr. Lowe grew up in San Francisco's Chinatown, and after graduating from UC Berkeley, he earned his law degree at Stanford. And we also have with us this morning Vilaska Winn. Vilaska is the managing attorney for specialty and collaborative courts of the San Francisco Public Defender's Office, where he has worked for 17 years. He graduated from University of San Francisco School of Law in 2004 and immediately began, I think, with the Public Defender's Office after that. He started the mock trial program at 826 Valencia, which is a nonprofit in San Francisco, and is passionate about mentoring the future generation of justice advocates. And Mr. Winn invited me to judge a mock trial at 826 Valencia about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe, and he doesn't know this, but now my teenage son is in fact a tutor at 826 Valencia. So your good work at introducing me to that organization has been paid forward. If Mr. Winn looks familiar to you, that is because he appeared in a TV commercial for AT&T, starring in the role of Dad in the airport reading a bedtime story to his faraway TV family. So with those introductions, let's bring everybody onto the screen and we will begin the panel with the obvious question, which is what ranks higher on the coolness factor, clerking for the notorious RBG or being in a nationally televised commercial. So I'll leave that to the participants to ponder. But let's start off. I would like to ask each panelist, why did you decide on law school? Justice Lowe, I'll start with you. I think you're muted.
Great. Thank you, Justice Brown, and good morning to everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on this panel with my colleagues here and to share some thoughts about pathways to the legal profession. So for me, it was not a linear path, and that's my way of saying that so much of how my career unfolded was a series of unexpected, unplanned, unpredicted events. So I grew up in an immigrant family. My parents came to the US in the late 1960s. I had a very typical, I don't know if we can even say that anymore, but anyway, typical immigrant story. My parents, came with almost nothing, and they built their life here. They were lucky that they had good educations, and they became family practice doctors for most of their lives and served their community that way. I thought I was going to follow in their footsteps, actually, because that was the expected thing. It was also the horizon that they knew. And luckily, I had an older brother who became a doctor, so he kind of checked that box off for me. That was helpful. But I just didn't really, have a big vantage point about what I could do career-wise. And so when I went to college, I was pre-med. And in fact, I went all the way through college, took the MCAT, got into medical school, and I left college with a deferred admission to a very good medical school. So it was only after college, when I had some time took some time off and reflected on what I was doing, that I realized that I actually had a number of other interests that have permeated my life and activities, including a really strong interest in K through 12 education, a lot of interest in diversity and civil rights issues, a lot of interest in social justice issues. I just didn't know how to make a career out of these things. And luckily, I had some good mentors who I had accumulated by then from college and beyond, and who just kind of steered me and said, look, you really should think about law school. And that's how it sort of happened for me. It happened for me quite late. And some of the data that I've been looking into about career preference formation among young people, and especially among Asian Americans, suggests that my story is not atypical. Compared to other groups, Asian Americans think about law as a career less frequently when they're in high school, and a far higher percentage of them think about it after they graduated from college. So we are kind of latecomers to the aspiration in our career trajectories or educational trajectories. And I think that reflects in part in many instances, like myself, the immigrant experience, the unfamiliarity with the system, and just not knowing any lawyers when you're growing up. And so hopefully through programs like this, we can increase that awareness and get that awareness earlier on.
Let me ask a quick follow-up. When did you first meet a lawyer? Did you know lawyers when you were in high school?
I knew one and only one lawyer, actually. And that person turned out to be, later in my life, an important person. And that was my congressman, Bob Matsui. Bob represented my home district of Sacramento for many, many years. His wife, Doris, actually now holds that seat in Sacramento. And Bob was unusual, to say the least. I mean, he was a lawyer at a time when Asian American lawyers, you could fit them in a very, very small auditorium, all of them in the whole nation. But here was this incredibly, well-spoken, accomplished person who had made his career in the law and was a very respected legislator. I was fortunate to meet him because when I was in high school, I was, believe it or not, I was a page in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he sponsored me back when there were such things. I don't even know if the program exists anymore, but this is, of course, before the advent of things like email and and texting and whatever that have made the job of delivering paper messages to offices obsolete. But in any event, he was an early influence and kind of piqued my interest in this set of issues. But of course, that wasn't enough. I mean, that was before I got to college. And like I said, by the time I got to college, I was still on this different track, thinking I was going to follow in my parents' footsteps. So I had other mentors along the way. And later in my life, actually reconnected with Bob, and he was a very important mentor to me. By the time I decided, that I was going to go down the legal path, he was thrilled, and he opened up a lot of doors for me.
That's great. How about Mr. Lowe? Why did you decide on law school, and when did you begin to form that notion about what you were planning to do with your career?
Sure. I found myself nodding a lot while Justice Lowe was sharing his story, just because I feel like so many of the elements that I also looked at or considered, definitely in retrospect, like I kind of factored those into my experience of choosing the law as a profession as well. I also come from an immigrant background, and as my bio indicated, I grew up in Chinatown, and I think one of the main elements when I thought about going to law school was the fact that growing up, I didn't know any lawyers, my community definitely didn't know any. And I think a lot of times, there was just the talk about law and the lawyers as this outside force. The law or lawyers were just people you had to deal with when you had a problem. If you had a workers' rights issue, then you would reach out to someone. There was no sense that there were people in our community who we could speak to. And especially with the language barrier, I think there was just a lot of concern about what the law meant, and you definitely didn't want the law to interact with your life in a way that I hope is changing a lot more. So I guess for me, when I first thought about going to law school, I graduated Berkeley with a psychology degree, definitely not anything. I know that's now a standard pre-law degree, but I didn't have it in my head that I would go to law school until I worked as a legal assistant and I met a number of the lawyers that worked on behalf of workers, on behalf of unions, and I saw how much passion they put into their work. And I think looking back, I don't know if it was necessarily healthy, but I remember some of the lawyers losing a big case on behalf of some workers, and they were just in tears. And I think that really moved me, the fact that their client's story had just been such a big part of what they were doing professionally that it just hit them emotionally. And I think I started looking into it. I think I had some classes at Berkeley recommended to me to say I think some undergraduates can take this class. And I think through that experience, I started thinking about it. And I think one last thing I'll share before I pass it to Vilaska is that I remember raising to my parents that I really wanted to go to law school, or that I was thinking about it. And I remember my parents getting really, really quiet. And then the first thing my father said to me was, "Are you sure your English is good enough?" And as someone that moved to the US when I was 3, it was funny because I think in my parents' mind, my English would just never get to the point where I would be good enough to be a lawyer, just because I think just the profession was put on such a pedestal that it was just seen as something that a Chinese immigrant kid was just not able to dream of even doing that. So, and now both my brother and I are both lawyers, and I think it's it is great to see this panel and to hope that there are a lot more people who will have role models for that in the years to come.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. How about Mr. Winn? When did you, or why did you decide to go to law school, and when did you come to that realization that that's what you wanted to do?
So I studied American Ethnic Studies in my undergrad years at the University of Washington. And I remember coming in to college, I think this was kind of a typical narrative. I had this expectation that I was going to be pre-med. And I remember my first intro to calculus class, I got a D-. And I was so excited because I got credit. And my mom was like, maybe you shouldn't be a doctor. And I was like, there's diversity in the medical profession. But I immediately fell in love with Asian American Studies, American Ethnic Studies. I became the president of our campus's Ethnic Studies Student Association. So I was really politically involved in our community. So my first job out of college was for the Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs. And I had never met a judge or a lawyer, but all my mentors were lawyers, and they were really strong Asian American community leaders. Velma Valoria, Kip Takuda. I remember they encouraged me to go to law school because I had a real passion for policy. So that was the first real opportunity where I started envisioning my path to law school. And when I came to law school, I just fell in love with indigent defense. And even now, I feel like looking back at my parents, my name Vilaska comes from the place where I was born. I was born in Anchorage, Alaska, and my Vietnamese name is Viet. My parents were Vietnam War refugees. So from a very young age, they had instilled this really deep value for public service. My dad was a longshoreman, and my mom worked her entire life at the post office doing the graveyard shift. So I already knew that I wanted to help. I wanted to be a public servant, and it just came together when I left college and made the decision to go to law school.
So each of you has mentioned what your major was in college, and I'm wondering whether you felt like your major was a hindrance or a help in applying to or going to law school, and whether you think there maybe are majors that help or hurt in terms of law school applications and taking law school classes. How about Mr. Lowe? Why don't I ask you that question?
Sure.
Because you mentioned psychology and how it's now considered sort of more pre-law accessible.
Yeah, I think I mentioned psychology as a common pre-law degree because I think a lot of people find themselves after graduating with that degree just thinking like, what am I doing next? Like, I'm not going to become a psychologist. I'm not going to go into clinical practice. But I think one thing I've definitely been telling people who've talked to me about going to law school is that it really doesn't matter what you're studying before law school. I think one thing is, I don't know that law schools necessarily want you to be committed to doing like specifically a legal studies program. I think they might be more interested in the fact that you're a passionate person, that you're showing that you have these skills perhaps that you developed, or like you have a particular interest that you really drilled down into. I think one thing is that, yeah, I think I would sum that up as law schools would prefer you be doing all these other awesome things in your life that you're really passionate about, and then one day you just kind of think about it and then you want to go to law school. I don't know that they want it to be super planned out.
How about Justice Liu? You were a biology major, and so did that help, or was it irrelevant, or how did that play into law school for you, if at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. What I'd tell those of you in the audience is, you know, I think undergraduate major, which you may be thinking about right now in terms of what you want to do and study, is, in my view, not that important with respect to getting into law school. I mean, the conventional thing is, you know, law schools admit a lot of people who have history, political science, or economics majors. That's just conventional. And that's probably more than anything a self-selection process, is that those people who are enrolled in those majors tend to gravitate towards law school. But that's not essential. And more than anything, I think the important thing is your undergraduate years are your opportunity to really explore and learn something that you want to learn. And you don't have to be overly career-minded about it, especially if you're thinking about law, because the great thing about law is that it relies on a set of general analytical skills, which can be learned through any number of disciplines. I've hired law clerks who were majors in math. I've, have law clerks who were, engineers, philosophers, and then of course my share of history and econ and political science majors too. But the point is that any disciplinary focus will give you a strong analytical foundation if it's something you love to study and you're willing to go in depth in it. And that's the one thing you learn about scholarly work generally, is that learning the right habits of mind will help you really in any career pursuit. But I would say in law in particular, because law itself is a generalist field that relies on patterns of thought and analysis that are actually common to science, engineering, philosophy, even the arts and humanities. And so there's a lot of possibility for you need not be overly narrow.
How about Mr. Winn? How about answering that question about whether your major impacted your law school applications or your law school experience?
And absolutely. I was really committed to social justice, and my trajectory in terms of what I wanted to do with my career never deviated from that path. And just to echo what the other panelists have said, the legal profession is very diverse. There are so many types of lawyers that come from different backgrounds. My wife, she is part of the front office for a Major League Baseball organization, and I'm at the opposite side of the spectrum where I'm in court almost on a daily basis. So I'm proud of my path in terms of studying American ethnic studies and being really committed to social justice. And it was just a natural evolution coming to law school and becoming a public defender.
Let me ask, did anyone have folks who tried to dissuade them from going to law school? Justice Lowe, did anyone try to dissuade you from going to law school with a family of doctors?
Well, dissuasion. Well, let's just say my parents were not entirely thrilled when I gave up my deferred admission to a very good medical school. I think it's not that they weren't thrilled. I think that the parents, now being one myself, you know, their natural inclination is to worry about your security and your stability. And I think that it is a challenge. I mean, these are some of the more intimate yet important challenges that students face when they are making their way, is that there are family expectations, there are family needs, actually, in many instances. And striking out and doing something unfamiliar is, I think people find it unsettling. And so you can't always count on familial support, right, for these choices. And there may even be instances where your parents will be disappointed in what you do. And you have to obviously keep in mind that that is well-intentioned. I mean, they're not trying to discourage you from pursuing your dreams, but it's just that you may be doing something unfamiliar to them, and they don't know how to be supportive, actually, of it because they don't know anything about it. And so it feels a little bit unsettling. I would say that, you know, of course, you know, it turned out just fine, of course, and my parents are plenty proud of me and all of that. But it was a gradual process. And again, one tremendous resource that exists today that did not exist even when I went to law school, and for, you know, the generation for Bob Matsui and others, is that they didn't have 60,000 Asian American lawyers who now populate the profession to be role models and hopefully mentors, you know, to the next generation. And so that's a tremendous benefit, I think, to the rising generation that I hope we can provide and continue.
Agreed. How about Mr. Lowe? Besides your parents' concern about your ability to speak English, did anyone try to put a damper on your desire to go to law school, or did anyone even express surprise that that was something that you were going to be considering?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think once I got into law school and started, and everything seemed fine, I think they were like Justice Lowe shared, they were plenty proud of me. I think the next part where they expressed concern was when I didn't go and take a firm job. I think that was kind of the next deviation from the main path, or the safer path. I think at that point in my life, in terms of my relationship with my parents, it was beginning to shift to them seeing me as like a friend, and as a friend and as a child. So I think at that point, I was able to take in their advice about the firm jobs being a more stable, definitely more lucrative path than public service, than the public interest world. But I think like it took time. Like it took time for me to explain like this is work that I'm passionate about. Like this is the community I want to serve. It's the same community that like I was raised in. And I think over the years, like especially as they've run into clients of mine like in Chinatown, and like my clients will like tell them about how excited they were to work with me. I think like it definitely like it eventually got to them that like they understand like why I really like doing this work. And like, but I think it's just a matter of education, and like I think just developing that relationship with my parents has been really nice actually.
That's great. Let me ask each panelist, can you describe sort of your day-to-day, just so the participants have an idea of the variety of things that one can do with a law degree besides working in a private law firm like Mr. Lowe mentioned. Mr. Winn, why don't you start with your job as a public defender? You mentioned being in court almost every day, which is not common for a law firm lawyer, for example, or it sounds like for your wife.
Yes, and it's been a little strange during the pandemic because a lot of courtrooms are over Zoom. But I would say my typical day is kind of divided between my role as a manager of the public defender's office, specialty and collaborative courts. When we talk about restorative justice, I really feel fortunate that what I do really is the actual transition of folks going back into the community. We have a clean slate program where we clear people's records so that they can get jobs, housing, public benefits, education. And it's pretty phenomenal seeing someone turn their life around. And that's really restorative justice. Kevin and I, we work on some cases that overlap, and I've been fortunate enough to work on client cases where we've saved someone from deportation and they've been naturalized. They get to move forward and be a part of our community. So in terms of managing all these different programs, I have to make sure that our staff have all the support that they need, and our client services are at a standard that is really excellent. Sometimes that means I have to come into court and meet with judges, or we meet with my colleagues from the district attorney's office. And I do still have an active case. So I'm currently working on preparing to go on a murder trial in a few weeks. So if you can imagine kind of juggling the schedule, I'm constantly talking to my investigation team, making sure that, witnesses during a time of pandemic have almost disappeared. And, people who are within distance of being subpoenaed and brought into court, we have to be very mindful of their safety, and at the same time try to figure out the best path forward in terms of how a trial will look like over the course of 3 or 4 months in the middle of a pandemic. So it's my day-to-day changes, it varies so much, and I'm constantly juggling those issues and concerns, but it's a job that I love, and every day I come into work I feel like I'm the luckiest person in the world.
That's great. How about Justice Lowe? You have a lot of things that you juggle as well.
So my day-to-day actually looks like a still shot. Me sitting at my desk reading. And I think, Justice Brown, you're very familiar with this. I work in an appellate court. So what that means is that cases come to us after they've already been heard by usually 2 courts, but meaning there has been a trial or some other judgment rendered in the court of first instance, which are the superior courts of California. Those are the trial courts. And then usually those cases have been appealed to the intermediate courts in California, which are appeals courts. That's where Justice Brown sits. And those cases are reviewed usually for legal errors by panels of 3 judges. And then only after that does a case come to our court, which is the state Supreme Court. And so every year we select maybe 70 or 80 cases a year to review. We limit that number because we can't hear everything. And so we try to pick those cases that are going to have sort of the biggest impact in the law, either clarifying a point of law for a bunch of other courts and litigants, or just deciding something that happens to be important to the state of California. And so by the time the case comes to us, everything is on paper, and there are no witnesses, there are no jurors in our court. It's all done on paper because the trial and all the witnesses and everything, that has already happened. So we are just reading the lawyer's papers about what kind of legal errors occurred in the proceedings, if any, and then we issue a judgment, based on that. That's my day job. I have a lot of, what I would call sort of extracurricular or out of court things that I do, including things like this. I'm very interested in diversity in the legal profession. And so I spend a lot of my time speaking to groups, as well as doing my own research on to help advance our understanding of what the challenges and possible solutions to increasing the representation of especially underrepresented minorities might be in the legal profession. And so I do a lot of you might call public service in that vein. I'm also very interested in access to justice issues, thinking about ways in which our legal system can be made more affordable, more accessible to people, because it doesn't really matter how many laws and rights that we put on paper. If people can't actually use them, then they don't have any practical effect. So those are some of the things that occupy my time. And most days I'm actually just glued to my desk looking at my computer, and it's not terribly exciting if you were to make a movie of it.
I will say that I think this is at least the third program that Justice Lowe has spoken on in the last few days, because I have been a watcher on a couple of those. So thank you for taking time on your Saturday to present with us today. Mr. Lowe, can you give everyone a sense of your day-to-day?
Sure. I was just laughing at Justice Liu's comment about it not looking great on film, because that's something that I think probably all of us have talked to journalists about. Like when they want to film B-roll with us, they're like, so do something exciting. And then typically it ends up with us at our desk or like walking down the hallway looking lawyerly, whatever that means. So
I will say nobody has asked to film my job as an appellate justice. I don't know, Justice Lowe, if that has been a different experience for you. Maybe you're more photogenic or something, but no one has been foolish enough to ask me to be filmed. Anyway, go ahead, Mr. Lowe.
Sure. I was going to say, as an immigration lawyer at a nonprofit, my day-to-day is probably more similar to Vilaska's day-to-day. And I think one thing I do love is the same variety. Like every day is different. Certainly during the pandemic, my job is a lot more based at home. But definitely before pandemic, and hopefully soon, I think I will get back into the different variety of things that I do. So I think one thing that I definitely miss doing is going into ICE detention centers. That's where most of our clients are. And I think I really miss the fact of just like meeting people in detention, getting to know them, hearing their story, seeing where we can help. And I think that's definitely something that I really miss doing because of the pandemic. But it's such a big part of our job. And currently it happens over the phone, and like phone access with people in ICE detention is definitely not the same as seeing them in person. Another big part of my job is, of course, going to immigration court and preparing for that, preparing with the family, collecting support letters from their community to make sure that we put everything before the judge in making the decision to whether or not they get separated from their loved ones here. Just a lot of different things that we do. As I mentioned, like we do a lot of media work. So oftentimes we'll look at a client's case and determine whether or not some media attention might be able to help move their case along, like whether or not putting a focus on kind of the family story will help illustrate that this impacts a lot more people than just the person facing deportation. And of course, kind of the third thing I'll mention is that in the same vein of like getting publicity for our clients, like sometimes we'll go to rallies and we'll be suddenly asked to talk about a client. So suddenly you're in the position of like giving an impromptu speech about your client and like trying to pass the mic to the family. But I think there's just like a lot of different opportunities depending on what you're interested in. But the day-to-day is definitely like very exciting, and similar to Vilaska, I feel like I wake up every day and I'm like excited to go to work and to work for my clients.
I had to mute myself because I was the person with the dog barking in the background. That is a pandemic decision that I very much regret making in this family. So I apologize for that. Let me ask Justice Lowe, how did your prior jobs inform your decision to seek a job in public service? I think you spent a couple of years in private practice, if I'm not mistaken, before spending most of your career in public service. So can you talk about the differences between those two types of practice?
Sure. After law school, I meandered a little bit. I should actually begin even before law school. Before law school, I was between college and law school. I spent 4 years, 2 years in graduate study, and then 2 more years working in Washington, D.C. in an agency helping to start the AmeriCorps National Service Program, which some of you may know about. And then after I left law school, I had the privilege to clerk for 2 judges, and then also I served in government another year working in the U.S. Department of Education. And then I worked at a private law firm for 2 years in a litigation practice. So apart from kind of looking at my resume and thinking this guy cannot keep a job, I think that bouncing around a little bit is actually kind of natural in the early going of your career. So just keep that in mind. I mean, it's good to try different things. You don't really know what you like doing really until you try them. For me, it was useful to get a perspective from all these different areas. Certainly the time that I spent in government before and after law school was incredibly valuable, just in learning how government works and the kind of accountabilities, the bureaucracy, how politics intersects with policy, these kind of basic things. And having an exposure to that is tremendously valuable in anything that a lawyer does. Having the private practice experience was great. I went to a law firm in Washington, D.C., knowing pretty much that I was not going to be a lifer there. But I think it was an important stop along the way because it's important to see how very talented people practice law at a very high level. And you're working for big institutional clients for the most part, businesses. It's also important to see how businesses think about their problems and the ethical roles that lawyers are supposed to play. Now, I won't sugarcoat it. I mean, I think that I knew that I wasn't going to be a lifer at the law firm because I had other interests. I didn't go to law school to, represent big companies. I went to law school because I wanted to pursue, other kinds of public interested, social justice oriented concerns. So I became a professor, after that. And when I was a professor at UC Berkeley for 8 years, I focused most of my research and writing and teaching on constitutional law, education law and policy, diversity issues and such. And these were, again, like kind of the things that had always captured my attention and motivated me. And so by the time I got on the bench, I felt like I had seen a lot of different worlds. And in, all of those influences, I think, have helped me in my current role, just in terms of making good practical judgments about what to do in cases, both kind of straight intellectual work, legal analysis that's required, as well as a little bit of common sense and practical wisdom that's needed to make sure that the law is not a straitjacket, in situations where people need a sufficient degree of flexibility, discretion to handle the varied circumstances of human affairs. So I think that, it has been a nice amalgam of lots of different experiences.
Let me ask Mr.
It wasn't planned. I mean, I have to say at the outset again, it wasn't planned. Like this is nice, but the way it looks, from a forward-looking perspective was not at all linear. And now I can give you the tidy version only because I'm living it from the other side.
That's great. Mr. Winn, let me turn to you because you have had your whole career in public service and as a public defender. Do you have friends in private practice who share with you any jealousy of the fact that you love your job every day? Or do you ever feel gee, maybe I wish I had done something in private practice, anything like that?
I don't have any regret where I'm at in life. And I do see some of my friends who, some of them have started off in the public defender's office. Some of them even started off in the district attorney's office, and they're in private practice. Some have their own law offices. Many are in law firms where they work such an exorbitant amount of hours that they have to really carve out time to see their own kids. And I think that is the ultimate sacrifice, because they're working so hard to provide for their families. But everyone has their own, I guess, journey and experience. For me, I think the biggest challenge was coming to law school. And I'm a pretty confident person, but I remember just being inflicted with a lot of self-doubt. I looked at all my classmates, and there were so many students that came from amazing privileged backgrounds, who knew how to take tests, who didn't have to study. And I had never met a lawyer or a judge up until the time where I decided to go to law school. And then I remembered why I went to law school, and that was to get involved in public service, to do something great with my degree. And that's something that is, something universal with everyone, watching this panel. You cannot teach heart. You can't teach passion. If you love to make a positive impact and change on your community, that will stay with you forever. But particularly in those moments where you feel so uncomfortable and you're in an unfamiliar situation, I had to remind myself the reason why I came to law school was because I wanted to help the community. And that really kept me going, and it made me focus on what I needed to do. I'm very fortunate that I'm now going on to my 17th year at the Public Defender's Office. My most phenomenal mentees and interns have that same perspective in terms of, being phenomenal justice advocates, because I can't teach them that type of passion and their own heart and perspective. All their experiences that had carried them over all their adversity, makes them who they are. And I'm pretty confident that there's so many of you like that, watching this panel.
I'll just share briefly. I spent about 6 years in private practice, 6 or 7 years in private practice after law school. And that was in large part because I had a lot of student loans from both undergrad and law school. And so let me turn to a question that some people may be wondering, if people feel comfortable sharing how they were able to finance law school, and certainly don't feel compelled to answer, but if anyone would feel comfortable answer. I will tell you, my parents did not have the money to put me through college or law school, so it was 100% self-financed for me. So I really had no choice after law school, or I felt like I had no choice but to work in a law firm for a number of years. And like Justice Lowe, I learned a tremendous amount, and it was very, very valuable, as well as remunerative experience. So would anybody feel comfortable sharing on that question?
I can quickly respond on that. I think my experience was, I think my parents were really worried about like how I was going to pay for law school. And I remember really looking into it, and ultimately, I think one thing that I would advise looking into is the Public Interest Loan Repayment Assistance Program. Like, it's a program that really differs across different law schools, but if you commit to doing public interest, a lot of schools will have a special program to help you to pay back the loans. But the terms of each program are very different. And I was really thankful that my law school at Stanford was able to cover a lot of the costs and to make it possible for me to do a lot of the public interest jobs that I did. I recently realized I'm like 10 years out of law school, so I'm right at the end of paying off my loans. But I remember for the first maybe 5 or 6 years, if it weren't for the LRAP program supporting me, I don't know that I would have been able to take the jobs that I did.
Anyone else want to jump in? Mr. Winn.
So I had to take out a lot of loans, and I was very fortunate. My wife is in charge of our finances because I can't be trusted. But I think it just goes back to, if this is something that you really want to do, your law degree is going to, pay you back tenfold, no matter what you do, once you make that decision. So I can't imagine, insurmountable loans, if I didn't know I wanted to go to law school. But the moment you decide, it'll work out. And what Kevin said, there are so many, programs right now, particularly if you're committed to public service, it makes it a lot easier.
Just to add that I was lucky that between working as a summer associate in law firms, which pay fairly handsomely, plus parental contributions, I was able to make ends meet in law school, and that was fine. I had also worked a number of years prior to going to law school, which helped. So everyone's in a different circumstance, and I think one of the things that we are discovering in our research on post-law school opportunities is certainly differential pressures that students face in terms of having to provide their earnings for their, sometimes for their families and even extended families. And this can be a significant challenge in terms of persuading law students, for example, to think about clerking. It's hard to turn down a six-figure salary at a very top-tier law firm in favor of saying, please go work for a judge for 1 year at a far lesser salary. But, I would still make the argument that these things are worthwhile, but it takes a longer-term point of view. And sometimes the information about those things is not communicated, or it's not communicated vigorously enough to students in order to really apprise them of the full scope of opportunities that they have in front of them, and the ways in which those opportunities can still help them meet their financial goals.
Let me ask Justice Lowe, could you briefly describe the Portrait of Asian Americans in the Law study that you and your team at Yale did? And in particular, I wanted you to speak about your findings relating to Asian Americans pursuing the law or not as a pathway to a career in government and politics. Mm-hmm. If you could sort of touch on that subject, that would be great.
Sure. So about 5 years ago, or a little bit more now, a group of law students at Yale, where I went to law school, and I teamed up to we were just looking at the landscape of information about diversity in the legal profession and noticing that so little was known about Asian Americans. That is, I'll just say as a top line observation that the invisibility of Asian Americans in the US discourse about diversity is very noticeable. And the headlines that we have seen in the past months related to the pandemic and some of the very tragically violent incidents that have been directed at Asian Americans have spotlighted this issue, but only, in my mind, confirmed that in the ordinary course of events, Asians are often forgotten about in the overall dialogue. And so that's one thing that we were trying to remedy through this study. And so we undertook the first systematic, comprehensive look at how Asian Americans are doing, basically across a number of sectors: government, private practice, judges, prosecutors, academia, in all the different sectors of the legal profession. And the basic storyline that we tell in the report is that over the last generation, probably from, maybe 1990 to today, Asian Americans have made tremendous gains in the legal profession. The number of Asian American lawyers has increased by about 5 or 6-fold in a single generation, which is really remarkable. The challenge, however, is that it has been very difficult for Asian Americans to reach the very, very top levels of the legal profession. And I don't think that this is just a pipeline issue, by which I mean there's some sort of time lag in terms of people reaching the requisite seniority to occupy top positions. I think there have been highly qualified Asian Americans, in the pipeline for many years now. And the numbers that you see at the very top law firms, in government and other sectors is in some parts anemically small. One statistic that really, jumped out at me was, if you look at, this is just one, but if you look at the elected prosecutors in America across all the county jurisdictions and state attorneys general and such, I mean, think about this. Think about what you read in the news, and think about how much power these people wield in our communities. The elected prosecutors, these are the top people who make the decisions, about law enforcement and resources in our communities. There are 2,400 some odd of the, elected prosecutors in America. 95% of them are white. 95%. And the number that are Asian, in today, that number stands at 8, not 8%, but 8 individuals out of 2,400 throughout America. That gives you a sense, and think about all the news we're reading about anti-Asian violence and these kinds of things. That gives you a sense of who is not at the table at the highest levels in thinking about these problems and lending their voice to them. So we have a long way to go, despite the many gains that have been made. So you asked Justice Brown specifically about government. I would say that our observation is that Asian Americans, compared to other groups, express less interest in law as a pathway into government and public service. This is actually consistent with voting trends among Asian Americans, that Asians somewhat defy the general correlation between education and wealth and voting frequency. Most people see a positive relationship between those two things. But Asians, despite having significant, on average, education and income, don't vote, at the rates that might be predicted, and we have to kind of think about that. Why is that? Is that because of language barriers? Is that because of no one's appealing to them to come vote? Is that because of their own hesitations within the community for this or that reason, right? So this is an important thing. But I'm actually kind of curious, especially from our audience today, whether recent events, observations over the last not just 1 year, but 4 or 5 years, have changed attitudes about engagement with politics, and maybe motivated a new generation of Asian Americans who want to come to law school because you can see in our environment that our voices are very, very needed.
I think that'll be an interesting thing to see if you continue with the study in the next 5 or 10 years, to see whether the events of the last year or so, and in particular the last few months, are going to effect a change in Asian Americans pursuing politics or government as a career after law school. We have one question that I'll throw out, and anybody who wants to answer can answer. And the question is it ever too late to go to law school? This person is 35 years old and in grad school for something else, but can't get away from thinking about law school. So I'll throw that out to anyone who wishes to answer. My personal view is no. I certainly had some older folks, not that 35 is by any stretch old. That's way younger than I am. I'll put that out there. But there were definitely people in my law school class who were not straight out of college, or not just a couple of years out of college. And I remember one in particular who was incredibly passionate about adoption and family law as sort of her second career after having had some kids and doing, I can't remember what her career was before. So that's my personal view. But anybody else want to answer that question?
I agree.
35 is looking pretty young to me right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wish I was 35.
That's so far in the rearview mirror, I can't even remember it.
I envy you, Megan. Never too late to go to law school.
Never too late.
Absolutely. We only have a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes left, but I know that a few of you mentioned mentoring, and that's something that I'm really passionate about and has been an incredibly important part of my career. I wanted to ask, let me see, Mr. Lowe, did you have some mentors in your life who helped you along your path, and how do you feel about now, as being an established lawyer, about mentoring younger lawyers and law students?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of my mentors were attorneys who were just like a few years older than me. I definitely never had the mentor who was like the elder in the legal profession who was guiding me along. And I actually really did appreciate that, because like people who are a few years ahead of me definitely already had a lot of perspective. And as someone, like, related to Megan's question, like, I was someone who went straight through from college to law school. And I think throughout it, I wish that I had had that perspective of like taking a few years off between college and law school. So to have mentors that were just like a few years ahead of me was really helpful in terms of just like navigating like what it meant to be a younger lawyer. And now certainly, like, I definitely, like, whenever anyone reaches out to me, not even for mentorship, but just for questions about like what it means to like go to law school or like how to prepare, like, I'm more than happy to do it, just because of like all the advice that I benefited from when I was navigating it.
Mr. Winn, did you have some mentors who are important in your career?
Jeff Adachi was such a huge force in my life. And I remember meeting Jeff in front of AABA when he was campaigning after he was ousted. And this was probably 2002, around there. And I was in law school, but he just made such a great impression on me. And I think I owe a lot of my career to Jeff. Fast forward, I remember I love to do stand-up comedy. It's just something that's really fun. Jeff came and watched me perform stand-up comedy across the street from AABA, where we initially met. And I remember he pulled me aside and just said, you got to keep doing this, because we need more diversity in Hollywood and in the entertainment field. So he not only was a mentor in my trial practice, but also in pushing me to be more creative. And that's how I got that commercial. And it was funny, when the pandemic started, AT&T reached out to us to re-up the commercial for another 6 months. So I think I was very fortunate to have someone who really looked out for my interest in my development.
We have another question as we wrap up or get close to wrapping up, which is, if we are interested in law, what can a rising junior do during the summer to further interest? And I can't tell if this is a rising junior in high school or rising junior in college, but in any case, does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I would just say, if you think about it from the standpoint of a law school admissions officer who's reading lots and lots of applications, the most important thing that you can do is just to do anything that you are passionate about. It doesn't have to be anything related to law per se. It has to be something that you feel deeply about and that you demonstrate a kind of commitment to. And that's what people really want to see in the applications, I think, that shine through, is that this is a person who has committed to something and dedicated their efforts to it, and is able to demonstrate a kind of energy and passion about whatever the issue is, whatever the cause is, whatever the project is. And I think that kind of speaks for itself. There is a danger, I think, for students of spreading themselves too thin. You can litter your resume with lots and lots of activities, but if none of them, really exhibit any depth or maturity or leadership, then the person who's looking at it doesn't really know what you're made of, right? So I would say no need to kind of filter that question through the lens of what can I do specifically for law. It's more like, what can you do that really speaks to your interests and the things you care about.
I think that's a great point about showing commitment to something rather than, I'm going to go check this box saying that I was a paralegal or something specific to law. I think we're a little bit past time here, so I really want to thank everybody for participating, both as panelists and as folks watching our chat here today. And I'll just ask one last question and then we'll be done. If anybody has any advice on that they'd like to give to the folks watching thinking about applying to law school, does anybody have any words of advice about how to go about the process of applying to law school?
I can go first. I think my quick tip is just don't be afraid to reach out to attorneys who are currently practicing. Just because I think people love talking about their work and they're happy to set aside time to talk with you. So definitely don't feel like you're imposing on them or taking up their time.
Yeah, remember who you are. I mean, even though you're in high school, you've accomplished so much, and what brought you to this point is going to bring you even further.
That's terrific. Well, thanks everyone for spending part of your Saturday with us. And I really have appreciated everyone's perspectives on this important topic. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Justice Brown. And thank you to our panel for that wonderfully insightful session. We hope you enjoyed today's panel. This session has been recorded and will be posted on our website at aaba-bay.com/pathways. This concludes our second session of the Pathways to Law Conference. We hope you'll join us for our third and final session entitled Law School Admissions, which will be held next Saturday, May 22nd at 11 a.m. We will be joined by Mario Lopez, the Associate Director of Admissions at UC Hastings College of Law, and Thomas Lee, Associate Director of Public Interest, Public Service Careers at UC Hastings College of Law, as well as law students Carrie Sherman and Samantha Mita. If you registered for this session or our first session, you'll receive a reminder and link to access next week's session. Thank you for joining us.